The events of this story took place when I was 18 and in my senior year of high school. I'm 27 now and still have horrible flashbacks from that Halloween night. My friends and I liked to party in high school, and Halloween was obviously one of the best nights to go out and party. We got to dress up in sexy outfits and have an excuse to act a little crazy. My friends usually drew all the attention from the guys we went to school with. I was still friends with all the boys, but none of them really ever showed any interest outside of friendship. Anyway, on this particular Halloween, we had a party at my friend Steve's house. Like a lot of high school parties, no one knew how to handle their alcohol. At about 11, the cops had already been called for a noise complaint. The party scattered and everyone ran as to not get detained or get their information taken by police. My friend Amy, who was getting into a car with her boyfriend, told me to jump into the car with her friend Dave, and he would take us to another party, which I begrudgingly decided to do. The car ride was weird. Just him and I, who didn't know each other and didn't really have much to say. Awkward. The car smelled like Slim Jims and body odor and looked rather messy. Dave had a mask, which was on his lap while he was driving. He had a hooded sweatshirt, blue jeans, and brown work boots on to complete the costume. He also had a scraggly beard and greasy hair. I tried asking questions to make the drive less awkward, but he didn't really answer them and didn't seem interested in holding a conversation. Finally, I asked what school he went to, and he responded, "I dropped out of college a year ago." So I asked, "Well, how old are you?" He responded in a shaky, almost nervous voice, I'm 25. This freaked me out a little bit because he was older than me and he just dropped out of college at the age of 25. Also, he was 25 and was just leaving a high school party. Trying not to let him in on the fact that I was kind of nervous, I asked, "So, how do you know Amy?" And he responded in his shaky and unflattering voice. He said, Who's Amy?" I sunk into my seat, pinching my sides, not knowing what to do. "She's the blonde who told me to get in the car with you." He responded with a very stoic, "Oh, her? Yeah. She told me you were single." I didn't respond. I honestly didn't know what to say. Did this guy really not know Amy? Or was he just tipsy and confused? I texted Amy as we were driving to tell her how angry I was, but she didn't answer. About 10 or 15 minutes in the car, which seemed like forever, we arrived at a house. It didn't seem to be a very nice part of town, or at least an area I was accustomed to going to parties. I looked for Amy's car or any car I recognized, but it was just too dark to point anything out. We approached a red door with chipped paint, lit up only by a dull front light. Dave didn't even knock and just walked into the house, so I followed him, hoping to see a familiar face. The house was cold and smelled awful. We walked into the front room, which I assumed would be the living room. It was dirty and had an olive green shag carpet with an old brown couch. The walls were white with chipped paint and stains everywhere. Piles of pizza boxes and beer cans lined the floors. The room was only lit by one lamp that was on the floor, and it gave off a very low light. On the brown couch there was a man and woman sitting very close together, but not really moving. They looked to be passed out, or maybe just drunk. We walked into the kitchen, which was just more of the same. Trash and that horrid smell of garbage. In the kitchen there was a man probably in his 20s who looked like he may have been using. He gave Dave a high five and introduced himself to me as Skip. He looked at Dave and back at me and smiled. His yellow teeth and bug eyes made my skin crawl. The other man in the kitchen was an older gentleman, maybe in his 40s or 50s. I couldn't tell. He said nothing and just looked at me. I felt sick to my stomach, and the only reason why I didn't run out of this place was because I had no clue where I was, and had no clue if these people were capable of anything dangerous. Again, I texted Amy with no answer, deciding to not call as my phone only had 5% battery. Dave escorted me into the back room, which was kind of like a screened-in porch. I felt a brief moment of relief seeing about 6 or 7 people out there. There were only 2 girls out of the bunch, and they were half naked and looked like they weighed a maximum of 90 pounds. I could feel everybody staring at me, but at least there was a group of people and I wasn't secluded or alone with this Dave. I know it sounds crazy, but I felt almost safe being around this larger crowd. But this temporary relief faded very quickly when the two girls left with all the guys who had been on the porch. They re-entered the house and disappeared out of sight. As I sat in this screened-in room trying to think of my options, Dave finally spoke up and said, "I think you're really cute." I said thanks and kind of shrugged it off. He got up and started to rub my back and began breathing very heavily. After about 5 minutes of the most unpleasant back rub I had ever had, he stepped in front of me and asked if I wanted to go somewhere more private. I said to him in a terrified, cracking voice, I'm sorry, but I'm not that kind of girl." I could see the displeasure and anger in his face, and I could feel the tears coming. Then nothing short of a miracle happened. One of the girls who went inside just a minute before began to scream erratically, swearing and yelling at everyone in the room. Dave ran upstairs, leaving me downstairs in the back room alone, and without even thinking twice, I got up and climbed out the window and ran. I didn't care that I didn't know where I was. I wasn't going to stop until I was to a gas station or a 7-Eleven or something. I was running down the street, staying close to the sidewalk, trying not to bring any attention to myself. After what seemed like a few minutes, I luckily approached a 24-hour Walmart. I walked in and had the night manager call my parents as my cell phone was now dead. It was about 30 minutes from my house and my parents were on their way. Just as I thought I could relax and try to put these horrifying events behind me, Dave and his friend Skip walked into the Walmart. They didn't see me, but I couldn't believe that they were in the same store. They were looking around like they were looking for something or someone. Was it me, or was I being paranoid? The next day, Amy called me and apologized all day, crying and asking what she could do to make it up to me. I got some solace that she confirmed the person I got into the car with was actually Dave and not some random guy, but was still left traumatized thinking about what could have happened. It's been almost 10 years since that night, and I know it could have been a lot worse, and I'm lucky that I was able to leave with no physical harm, but still wouldn't wish the experience I had that night on my worst enemy. I haven't seen Dave, Skip, or any of the people I saw that night, and hope I never do again.
It was late October in Sofia, Bulgaria. That year, Halloween fell on a Saturday, and my friend Minchko was throwing a massive shindig at his parents' apartment. Now, this guy was rich by Bulgarian standards, born into money. So when I say apartment, don't think of a typical, grotty Sofian flat. Think more along the lines of one of those unrealistically huge apartments from an American sitcom. His parents had gone away for the weekend to either Spain or Italy or somewhere else suitably warm, and as such, things were set to go wild. When the night finally rolled around, I dressed up in my zombie costume and set out to meet some friends. Minchko's invitation said that the party started at 8, so naturally, me and my group of chums didn't plan to arrive until 10. Gotta be fashionable. When we did arrive, most of the guests were already pretty drunk. The vodka was flowing freely, put it like that. They had a massive punch bowl, which was probably only 10% juice, knowing Minchko. Some of us had a few midterm exams coming up, so we didn't want to go too wild. We just had a few beers, while everyone else pigged out on punch. Other than the people on my course, there was one other guy who wasn't really drinking that night. Some dude in a wolfman mask who was just hanging around the punch bowl. He didn't seem to know anybody at the party and was keeping to himself. Looked a little awkward, to be honest. The friendly half of me wanted to introduce myself, invite him to hang out with me and my friends. My socially anxious other half, however, decided against that. The night goes on, and one of the partiers starts to complain about having stomach pain. I figure he's overdone it. Some guys really can't handle their alcohol. He makes his way to the bathroom and starts vomiting. Not long afterwards, another guest starts complaining about the same problem. And then another, and another. Eventually, a dozen or so people are grabbing their stomachs in pain. Things start to seem serious, with some people even vomiting on the living room floor. A little worried, someone calls for medical assistance. At the hospital, things turned out not to be an extreme instance of alcohol poisoning. Instead, we found out that the punch bowl contained a secret ingredient that someone had slipped in. It had been laced with rat poison. Thankfully, the dosage wasn't high enough to kill anyone immediately, but without treatment, the amount could have been fatal within a few hours. At a party full of drunk people, it was totally possible that no one would have been sober enough to react appropriately and call an ambulance. Somebody also could have easily passed out, not realizing that they'd been poisoned. Thankfully, though many were hospitalized, nobody ended up with any prolonged health issues. When we were questioned about what we all knew, the guy in the wolf mask came into my mind. He had been hanging around the punch bowl. I mentioned it to the police, and said that one of the other guests must have known who he was. Talking to my friends about it afterwards, though, it seemed like nobody did know who he was. Everybody assumed that he was a friend of somebody else's, and didn't bother to question his attendance. As far as anybody could remember, nobody talked to him, nobody saw him without his mask on, and nobody even remembered who he turned up with, or even when he arrived at all. He had just slipped in unnoticed. To begin with, the police investigation turned up very little. It seemed as though it was just a one-off incident, some guy wanting to cause harm to a lot of people at once. But people like that rarely try this sort of thing only once. Almost 1 year later to the day, on the next Halloween weekend, the exact same thing happened at a party in a different part of town. This time, the amount of poison used was increased. 3 people almost lost their lives that night, and 10 were hospitalized. This time, however, the perpetrator was tackled by another partygoer who realized what he was up to. Under questioning, the police realized that the guy in the wolf mask was obviously a little disturbed in the head. He cited an event known as the Jonestown Massacre as his inspiration behind his actions. Looking into it, it turns out it was an event in the late 70s where over 300 members of a cult died after being forced to drink from a poisoned punch bowl. This unstable nutjob wanted to pay homage to the largest mass suicide in history. For the first time in my life, I was damn thankful that I had exams coming up. I'm known for going a little bit wild at parties, and for trying to drink everyone under the table. Who's to say I wouldn't have chugged more poison punch than my body could have handled? Whenever Minchko hosts a Halloween party now, he always checks under everyone's mask at the door, just to make sure they're on the guest list.
When I was little, my parents divorced, and I went to live with my dad, as he was moving to a new town. We ended up buying this big house out in the country, outside a little podunk town. This house was huge for the 2 of us, but it was right on a little pond with an island, so it was cool. There were other houses around, but it was basically surrounded by cornfields, which scared the hell out of me because of the movie Children of the Corn, which had just come out, and it still terrifies me to this day. Anyway, freaky stuff started happening almost immediately after we moved in. On Halloween, my dad and I brought this huge pumpkin, carved it, and put it in the front window. We went out of town one night, and when we came back, it was smashed in the middle of the living room, 10 feet from where it was sitting. I didn't think much of it because my dad played it off, but I then heard him on the phone with his new girlfriend later that night, saying how freaky it was. He moved on pretty quick after Mum, straight player. Weird and random noises happened pretty much every night, and we just grew used to it. Even voices started, but my dad always told me it was the house settling. I have never heard a house say the name Jeffrey, even when it settles. That was when I would always hear someone calling out. But then there are 2 messed up instances that happened that first scared us into selling the place. Even years later, my dad still talks about how it freaked him out. The first was the night when we had a really bad storm. I was 10 or so. My dad was done letting me crawl into bed with him anymore, so I had to brave that on my own. It was about 3 in the morning, and this storm had been raging for a few hours. We hear this loud boom from the first floor. Both of our rooms were on the second, and then we hear glass shattering. My dad yells at me to stay upstairs and he goes down to investigate. He came back up 20 minutes later and tells me to go to sleep. Turns out our bay windows had been blown out during the storm. The freaky thing was all the glass was outside the house, not in shards in the room. He got it fixed the next day and never mentioned it again. The second was when we had to pull down the attic that was in the hallway between my bedroom and the bathroom. One night I woke up to go to the bathroom, and as I was walking down the hall I ran into the hanging attic door. My dad was sound asleep in his room, so it freaked me out. However, as I was walking back to my room after my piss, I ran into that door again. I heard some rustling going up on in there, and figured it was my dad, so walked past it towards his room, but he was in there snoring. I freaked out and told my dad. He got up, turned on his bedroom light, all angry at me. We both looked into the hall, and even though the hallway light was off, we could tell the attic was now closed. My dad was pissed, told me to go to bed and turned off the light. To this day, I still turn on every damn light upstairs of my current house when I have to pee, much to the dismay of my wife. We moved soon later, and I have never gone back to that place. About a year ago, my family and I were visiting with my dad and stepmom. She was actually the girlfriend from the original story, and we got to talking about the house and how it tormented me. My stepmom said she stopped going over there because of all the weird haunting stuff. My dad said he never told me growing up because he knew it would scare me, but he knew the house was haunted. He said the house used to be in town, but when the widow who lived there finally died, the new owners decided to move it out to the country on the land by the pond. He said the day they moved in just happened to be the old lady's funeral. He said they purposefully drove the house by the graveyard as they were having the cemetery, and stopped and opened the front door to let her spirit back in. That's messed up. Anyway, the new owners didn't stay there long, and my dad bought the house shortly thereafter. And that explained a lot as to why so many strange things kept happening.